Great. Okay, so here we are at our third workshop with Brandon, workshop number 3, extending and debriefing our first conversations. Whether those are ones that have happened already or whether you're getting yourself psyched for having your first ones, we're glad you're here. And after tonight's workshop, we're going to transition to holding shorter check-ins for anybody who wishes to come and debrief and continue working on our conversational skills. And the first one of those will be Thursday, May 9th. They are an hour earlier than this one at 6 p.m. Central, 7 Eastern, and go for 45 minutes. And John Sabin will facilitate the first one, and then I'll facilitate some of them, and who knows, maybe other people will, but it'll be a chance for us to keep talking to each other and sharing what we're learning. Because what I'm hearing already is it's a learning experience. So with that said, though, we're really super glad to have Brandon continue to train us, launch us, guide us. And so I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you, Brandon.
Thank you so much, Madeline. It's a delight to be here with you all tonight. And this is the good stuff. This is like when we debrief our conversations, this is where all the learning really happens. And I want to encourage you that if you feel like, woo, this is a learning process when you go out to have your conversations, you're doing it right. I am still learning, and I have been doing this for over 20 years. And if I stop learning, I will know that I'm not doing it correctly and I need to do something else. So just because we feel like, we're maybe on a steep learning curve does not mean that the conversations are not effective. We can both be in the process of learning and be having super impactful conversations at the same time. Tonight, we're going to have a little more of a free-flowing session. It's basically broken down into 3 segments, but depending on what comes up, we may change course in response to what emerges. So the initial plan is this. Madeline shared with me that there were quite a few questions about how to get the conversation started. So we're going to start by going over some tips and tricks on getting the conversation started and getting comfy with that. And then I had promised you last time when we practiced our stories, when we started to do that process of getting our stories rolling and thinking about what we could include in that phase of the conversation, I promised you a bit of a deeper dive template to keep working, to use for keeping working on your story and refining it. So I have that for you, and we're going to step through that together. And then the third part is to hear from any of you about conversations that you've had and what came up there, and also maybe what's come up in the imagination of conversations that hasn't happened yet. So maybe you sort of walked through in your head what this could look like and go, geez, I wonder what I would do if A, B, or C happened. And so if that has happened already or something comes up in the course of this call, we're going to address those questions as well, even if they're not from actual conversations, but more so the thought about conversations. So those are the 3 segments, and I'm going to launch in now by sharing out my screen and walking through some best practices on getting the conversation started. Now, the key thing about getting the conversation started is that it's comfortable for you. Basically, the goal here is to non-judgmentally ask the person that you're opening up the conversation with where they're standing on climate change. And so that can be done by talking about climate change generally. We don't necessarily have to use the words climate change. We could use the words conservation, for example, depending on the area and the person. We can localize and talk about something that is specific that's happening in the community related to climate change. So there are many ways to frame, but our goal, what we are trying to get to, is to non-judgmentally ask this person in a way that feels comfortable to us, because if we're comfortable, they're going to be comfortable. In a way that feels comfortable to us about where they stand on climate change. So a couple of these I touched on briefly last time, so a couple might sound a little bit familiar, but I'm going to go into a little bit deeper. I'm going to go into them in greater depth right now. So the first one is the how are you response, right? So when we're meeting people in the world, we talked about all the different ways that we encounter people in our social networks. Usually the conversation starts with some version of how are you? And maybe people will ask, what's new? Or what have you been up to lately? And these are great opportunities to get into the conversation into in a very natural way. So we might respond something like, well, I'm doing great. I've been doing X, Y, and Z, and I've been thinking about the upcoming primary elections a lot and thinking about climate change and where do the candidates stand on climate change. And what do you think? What do you think about that issue? Like on a and we can pair these or not. You can just ask broadly, open-endedly, what do you think about that issue? Just a complete, broad, open-ended question. Or we can pair the how are you response with number 3, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think it is for our elected officials to be addressing climate change? And the fun thing about the scale of 1 to 10, right? So for some people that feels natural. For some people it feels awkward. You just need to know what kind of person you are and act accordingly. But if it feels natural to you, which it does to me, I ask people this a lot. If it feels natural to you, what the scale of 1 to 10 allows you to do is it sets you right up for a non-judgmental response to help continue to build trust. So if someone said to me, oh, how are you, Brandon? What have you been up to? I say, oh, I'm good, some little small talk response, this, that, and the other. And, with all of the wildfires that have been happening in California, I've been thinking a lot about climate change, actually. And the primary election is coming up like right away. And I've been thinking about where do my elected officials stand on this issue? And what do you think? Where do you stand on that issue? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is like, not important at all, and 10 is like really super duper important. How important is it to you where our elected officials stand on climate change? Or, and you could ask them how it is, how they feel about where their elected officials stand. You could ask them, how important of an issue is this to you and your family? And or how important do you think it is that our elected officials act on climate change, right? So there are different ways that you can phrase that. And when they give you their response, what you are now set up to do is, no matter what the response is, to react with non-judgment. So if they were to say a 4, then I might say, oh, a 4. Why not 2 or a 6? What's on both sides of the issue for you? So immediately you're showing them that you are open to hearing their cognitive dissonance, which, as we talked about when we were stepping through the BRAVE methodology, like people are messy. We all have cognitive dissonance, and it's helping them talk out loud through that cognitive dissonance that is going to ultimately help them to self-persuade. So that's the scale of 1 to 10 opening. And then the open-ended election and climate question can be a how are you response or not. It can just stand on its own. If if you don't have like a how are you or a what's new or what have you been up to prompt to respond to. So you could just be talking to somebody and, just like you bring up anything in a conversation, just like you might say, oh, last week I did X, Y, or Z, or my grandchildren did this. You might say, oh, I've been thinking a lot about the primary elections coming up and climate change as an issue that we, kind of need to be thinking about. And have you been thinking at all about that? Like, are you planning to vote? Where are you standing on climate change? Just an open-ended question in a conversational way that feels comfortable to your voice. Because again, what we really want them to do is give us a response, any response. It doesn't matter what response on where they are standing on climate change, so we can start to look for those breadcrumbs of a story to draw out from them, in the manner that we talked about last time, where we're acting like, sort of little investigators and listening for a breadcrumb of a story. And um, so these are all just different doorways in to getting the breadcrumb of a story where we can ask follow-up questions, and we can start using those skills of the open-ended tell me more, the listening for the values that we can attach our story to, starting to share little bits of our story. So the doorway in there are many, many doorways in, and these are not exhaustive. These are 3 pathways. And I also want to invite you to think creatively about what is a comfortable doorway for you. Now, last week, we talked a little bit about how bringing in the local impacts can be very helpful. So that's something to where if there's a local impact happening that is in sort of the awareness of the whole community, that's a great thing to bring in when you're doing the how are you. For me, living in California, things like wildfires and other sort of weather related things are a good local doorway in. That's going to be different in Wisconsin, but we're all experiencing more extreme weather events, right? And so that's one that's kind of in the consciousness of everyone, where you can say, gee, I've been thinking a lot about all these extreme weather events we've been having, and just starting to think more about climate change. What do you think about climate change? Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think it is that we need to address it, right? You don't have to put it together with the election necessarily right at the beginning. That's just one way to do it. But, the arc of the conversation that we want to have kind of starts with the climate change piece and then moves to the election piece. So if you want to save the election piece for later, you can, if it's a helpful as a doorway in, because everybody's talking about elections now because it's in the news like 24/7, then that, you know, that again is a personal preference. So you can do them together at the beginning, or you can separate and just start with climate change. And looks like Madeline just put something fun in the chat, that we all experienced the bad air pollution from the Canadian wildfires. Yeah, exactly. Showing that we're all interconnected. And Marianne says, if you think about climate change as something we need to be thinking about, doesn't that shut off some possibility for you to be non-judgmental if the person doesn't think it's important? Yes, depending on your tone and the way you phrase it. Excellent, excellent point to bring up, Marianne. So we really want to be careful about our tone in that beginning opening conversation, and that as we're saying, gee, I've been thinking a lot about X. What do you think about that? It's really important to avoid a tone that sounds strident. The tone should sound curious, and to avoid phrases that sound strident. Like, we all have our sort of like little activist soapboxes probably that we get on sometimes because we're very impassioned about these issues, right? Where we start to go, we need to do X, Y, and Z because X, Y, and Z is so important, right? I know that I have this. And I was efforting very much in my tone there to not sound like that, right? To sound really like, just something new that I've been rolling around in my head versus, oh, we need to, etc. Now, towards the end of the conversation, after we've gone on a sort of journey with folks and they've self-persuaded a bit, there is a moment when we can be a little bit more direct about where we are, right? Once we get to that E of brave, that where we're sort of extending the engagement question and what are we going to do now? That's where we can be a little more clear about, for me, if we were doing the 1 to 10 scale, right? I'll say it with and without the scale. For me, I'm really at a 10 because imagine we had talked about fairness, right? And that was the shared value. I'm really at a 10 because I think fundamentally addressing climate change relates to fairness, that all people should be able to breathe clean air and have a world free of pollutants and contaminants, and that I want a future for my grandchildren where they have the same access to resources that are clean and pure. And so you can kind of make your case a little bit at the very end after you've attached to shared values, and you can make, like, once you've linked arms around the shared value, you can then make an ask that connects back into what you've talked about and be really clear about where you're coming from. And it's not that we're hiding the ball at the beginning, it's just that we are really placing ourselves in a place of curiosity and discovery. And so later in the conversation is where we're going to move to our direct sharing. But in the beginning, it's more curiosity and discovering. Yes. Are there any videos showing an example of this where someone is self-persuading? Yes, there's a video that we often use in trainings. From several years ago. I want to say probably around 2014, 2015, a conversation that was held on the issue of access of trans people to bathrooms. And it's a great conversation we use in training a lot. And I can maybe send the video link over to Madeline to share with the group. It's a great example, or we can watch it together and debrief it in the next session. Yeah, it's a great example of self-persuasion. Awesome. All right. So I want to invite all of you to, like, this is a place, one of the fun things about courageous conversations is that you can really bring in your own personal creativity. We actually find that, by the way, that even though it can seem more overwhelming, the courageous conversations from the start than like getting a script and doing a phone bank, then a script or a door knock. We actually find that volunteers stick with these kinds of conversations more long term, because they allow us to really be dynamic and to be on this, sort of creative learning journey together. So I really want to invite all of you to think creatively about how you can get into the conversation at the beginning and what feels comfortable for you, because we all do have different conversation styles, and share them with each other, because what one person comes up with might spark something in another person. And even if it's like, we always, when we talk about deep canvas conversations, which are not exactly what we're doing, but this is sort of a lighter version, we always talk about the first one is like the first pancake, right? It's like a little kind of messy and not quite that perfect disc. And so even if you think your doorway in that you've thought of is a first pancake, or maybe even a batter that didn't quite come out correctly, like maybe you forgot the eggs, then please still share your prompts with each other, because the back and forth, like the dynamic back and forth, will spark ideas among you. And it's really helpful to work on this stuff as a community and share ideas and best practices. Any questions about the opening, clarifications, ideas that cropped up?
I have a question about the story of self.
Mhm.
Um, like when do you use that? At what point would you
Great
use
question.
that?
Yeah, so, and it's going to be a perfect segue to go over our story worksheet. You would think that I paid you to plant that question, but I did not. So the place, the moment that we know that we are ready to start sharing our story is when we've sort of grasped enough from the person that we're talking with to get a hint of what their values might be. Because we want to share a story that attach, or a version of our story that attaches to their values. So we're going to be doing a little bit of investigating, asking things like, how does this affect you and your family? Enough so that we kind of can get a hint, so using our tell me more, using silence, using how does this affect you and your family, to get enough that we can make a little bit of a guess to say, it sounds like you really care about fairness, or it sounds like you really care about honesty, or about safety and security, or about family responsibility, some value, right, that underlies all the issues that we care about. So you want to ideally have had enough information come out of the person that you can make that educated guess and ask deeper into it. Can you remember a time that that crystallized for you? And then they're going to say something, and it's not going to be a full-on personal story, right? It's going to be some additional little nugget. And then that's where you're going to start sharing your story, because at that moment, by starting to share your story, you are showing them that, like, this is what we're doing now. You're modeling, you're giving them that social cue that it's okay to share at greater levels of depth. And so you're starting to share, but you're not doing it all at once like a speech. Like, we kind of practice it all at once, because we're practicing. Much like, I might have said this last time, much like a basketball player will stand from one spot and shoot a bunch of baskets to practice. That would never happen in a game, right? You have to be moving around and passing the ball and thinking on your feet. Same thing with story practice. We practice it all in a row. But when we get into the conversation, we're just having it like you would have a conversation with anyone you meet or talk to, where you share a little bit and then they share a little bit, and it keeps being a back and forth as you share into greater and greater depth. And you sharing is going to help open them up more. So, like, if you feel like the conversation's getting stuck, is another time when you can share your story at greater depth, as a way to prompt them to share a little bit more. So anytime the conversation feels like it's getting stuck, tell me more is great. Silence can be good, because maybe they're just processing, and sharing a story tidbit of yours can be good, and showing some more vulnerability. And so, like, the time when like, this is the time is when you've got that shared value. But if it feels like the conversation is getting stuck before that, and you've tried tell me more and you've tried silence, that might be a moment to start sharing your story a little bit as well, to prompt something more in them. Okay. I'm seeing questions in the chat. Lisa asks, to what extent do you use this technique with someone one knows pretty well? I would guess it's harder to act non-committal regarding a subject if you are talking with someone who one knows. Yeah, I think it's a great technique for people that we already know. And the key thing there is be yourself. So if they already know that every Saturday for the last 10 years, you've been going door knocking with Citizen Climate Lobby and they know why you've been doing that, then probably acting like you're neutral about climate change is not a good plan, right? It's not going to build trust in the conversation. Like foundationally, we want to be building trust in the conversation. And the idea isn't really to pretend that we don't care, right? Like we do care. We're not trying to hide the ball on that. What we are doing is just starting the conversation from a different place, and it's a place of curiosity. So, you know, the way I would do this in my style, which does not need to be your style, but just to give you an example that's authentic to me, is I would make some sort of like little self-deprecating joke, right? I would say like, okay, I'm the crazy climate lady who's been going out knocking doors and talking to strangers about climate on my Saturdays, but what about you? Like, I'm really curious. What's your feeling on this issue? Have you thought about it at all? So again, you're not pretending you're somebody that you're not, you're not like, really, I was lying. I was at knitting club, but I've been telling you I've been at the climate canvas all this time. You're being authentically yourself, and you're communicating genuine curiosity. And it does need to be genuine. Like, it's really important to put yourself in a state of mind where you really actually want to know. And the way that I do that as somebody who has a very fierce and strident position is that I remind myself before the conversation that this is not going to be a conversation that gets me any closer to my goal if I do not come with curiosity, and that curiosity is like the key. It's like the key into the doorway to open up this person that I care about very much, and that we haven't had the open conversation about this issue in that way, right? So that's what works in my brain, and it's important for you to figure out what works in your brain to put yourself in that curious frame of mind. But that was a great question. So you definitely can use all the steps with people that you know, and you can just disarm. It doesn't need to be like an elephant in the room as you're trying to walk through the conversation, because that can make it awkward. You can just disarm it right at the beginning by acknowledging like, hey, you know that I do X, Y, and Z on this issue. I'm actually genuinely curious about what you think. Okay, Stephen asks, have I already shared my story template in this session? I have not, and I am not going through it yet, and I will promise to walk you through it with it on screen. But thank you for asking that. I have been known to forget to share my screen and be not showing people a thing that they are supposed to be seeing. So thank you for asking, and I promise I'll put it on the screen in just a moment. And Jay says, just like when I'm making new member calls for CCL, while I share some things I would keep in my primary goal, this conversation is listener. Jay, that is an awesome comment. Do you want to expound on that at all?
When I'm doing new member calls, my goal is relationship building. And I think relationship thrives when people are being listened to because they're organizing their thoughts and coming up with things that they don't come up with when they're alone in their own thinking.
That's right.
So if I say, oh, you ski, I'd love to ski, and then I go off and talk for 5 minutes about skiing, whatever they've been building goes poof. So I want to be listening to them.
Exactly. Brilliant. Yeah. And giving folks that space. So our little rule of thumb is listen about 75% of the conversation and share about 25% of the conversation, just to keep that balance so that we are giving them the space. And it's, oh, I love that. Elizabeth says, be interested, not interesting. Brilliant. Love that. Yeah, and it's like there's a time and a space for everything, right? And it's really hard. it's really hard when we care about something a lot sometimes to be the listener, right? Because we have so much enthusiasm about it. But it's really important in these conversations. And it's again, it's a practice, right? So maybe the first conversation is more like 50%. And then the next one is like 40%. And then, we're getting to where we're sharing at 25%. It might take some time, and that's okay. And yes, Lisa says it sounds like meeting with members of Congress. Absolutely. Okay. Here is the personal narrative guide. I hope. Is that what everybody is seeing on their screen? Awesome. Like not my desktop or something. Great. So one of the things that I just mentioned was that earning trust in these conversations is really important, right? Our goal in these conversations is to get the person that we're talking with to trust us enough that they will talk out loud through their own cognitive dissonance with us, right? So trust is fundamental. And stories, which we sometimes call public narrative, help us do that, right? They help us connect across surface differences in the manner that we talked about last time, and help the people that we're speaking with open up and share so we can identify those shared values. So there are a few key elements in personal narrative, and y'all are gonna have this worksheet, so I'm not gonna necessarily read through it word for word. I'm just gonna hit some of the high points so you understand how it's structured and how to work with it. This first section is our key elements of personal narrative. So these are things that as we refine and practice our story and come up with different stories, that we can try to sort of check ourselves, and by making sure that our stories include these elements. And we can also use this to help people coach us, right? We all need coaches. I used to be a personal trainer, and all the personal trainers had personal trainers because we can't actually coach ourselves, it turns out. So you can recruit people who love you to be your coaches, and ask them some debriefing questions after they hear your stories. Like, did it feel like it had a clear beginning, middle, and end? Did you see, images when I shared my story? What motivates me? So you can use this to develop your story, and you can use it to help people coach you. And there are two methods for writing your story. We talked a little bit about this last time, and they're just written out for you here so that you have them for reference. One of them is thinking about challenge, choice, outcome. This is a model that comes from Marshall Gans, who is sort of a giant in the community organizing world. He is a professor at Harvard, and he was back in the 60s. He worked with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. And so this is the model that he came up with: challenge, choice, outcome. And the reason that this model can be helpful is a lot of times our values come out in our choices. For some people, that method just doesn't work. It just isn't what resonates with them. And so we have method number 2, which is peeling the onion of your why. It's continuing to ask yourself why questions about your own belief in climate, your own values, and how those formed. So we talked about that last time as well when we started to bullet out our stories. So those are laid out there for you. And then here we have a list to support you in listening for shared values. So these are some values that you might hear expressed by the other person. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list. There may be other values that you hear that aren't on this list, but this is just so you can kind of have a basis in the back of your mind as you're listening for those shared values. And so that whole first section is really kind of like a recap of the training. It's kind of like a little cheat sheet for you to have handy and work with. The second part is sort of walking you in greater depth how to use each of the methods. So we have like this little 3-step process of writing out the bullet points for your challenge choice outcome, filling in the details, your clear visual sounds and smells, and then editing it down. And similarly, we have a 4-step process here for using the why. And then there's a little section here on connecting story of us and story of now. And this is really here to support you in getting to that engagement ask. It's not always going to be relevant in every single one of your conversations, because sometimes your engagement ask, depending on where the person is starting from, might not be all the way to turning out and being a climate voter. You know, if somebody is starting from a position that's very opposite to you, you very well may be able to get there with them in one conversation. That absolutely can happen. However, in those situations when somebody is starting out very opposite to you, you may not get all the way there to that action of being a climate voter. And that doesn't mean that value can't be drawn from the conversation. It may be that the next step is that you're going to continue the conversation. You're going to meet for coffee next Thursday. It may be that they'll read an article that you send them, or maybe they'll come to a CCL meeting or Zoom with you. So there might be an appropriate ask that's short of all the way to being a climate voter, but still keeps you on the journey with the folks. And so depending on where on the spectrum that ask is, story of us and story of now may be more or less relevant. This is where story of us is like, what is our organization called to do? So if you're inviting them to a CCL meeting or to be a climate voter, maybe even you're inviting them to make a plan to vote with you. Maybe you guys are going to go together to vote. Bringing in story of us and story of now helps the person see themselves in the movement and helps communicate the urgency. So story of us is, what is the CCL program called to do? And story of now is, what is the immediate action step and why is it so important right now? So that includes what hopeful action we're inviting people to take, which of course is being a climate voter. So invite you to work with those pieces as suits your conversation. Invite you to come up with many different stories, right? We all have been on this planet, even the youngest of us in the room here, we've all been on this planet long enough that our whole stories don't fit in 4 minutes. So we have lots of different stories, and that's super useful because we want to have those different stories in our back pocket when we're talking with different people where we might have different points of connection. So, you know, there are lots of different metaphors that we use. I like to think of having different stories in the back pocket. You might think of it as a toolkit, depending on what kind of metaphors you like. One of the things that's really important as well is to have more and less vulnerable stories in our back pockets or in our toolkit. So when we're sharing our personal stories and what formed our values, those can be very vulnerable, formative experiences that we're sharing. And we may not feel like we're up for being equally as vulnerable every day. So I think it's always great to have a story that feels safer for those days when we're not feeling as adventurous and like we want to be as out there. And it's also great to have a story that sort of pushes the edge of our vulnerability for those days when we're feeling extra confident and want to kind of try to push ourselves to the next level, and some stories in between. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions on the narrative guide and worksheet, or stories generally. And folks can feel free to raise a physical or an electronic hand or type in the chat. John. Looks like, did you raise your hand?
You're muted, John.
There. I'm thinking of a situation where you started to talk to somebody and it's maybe not shared values, but what you run into, especially like on a climate topic, is they have a very strong feeling about how the problem should be approached. And maybe it gets framed as we think the market should take care of it, or we think government's too big, or we don't want government handling this, is kind of the variation on the theme. And so you're not connecting to them necessarily on a value basis when you run into this. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you see what I'm getting at? That some people just
do. Yeah, so in other words, they think it should be addressed, but they don't agree with the government is the mechanism for addressing it. And so that then is getting us stuck on the connecting climate change and voting. Is that, do I hear your question
Yeah.
correctly?
right.
Okay, great. So believe it or not, we still want to go back to that shared value. And so, we want to understand, why is it that they feel like the market is the right way to address the challenge, right? And so getting down into how it affects them and their families is really important, right? And so you know, how the conversation might go as an example is, oh, well, government's just too bloated and can't do anything right, and and you know, well, how does that affect you and your family? Well, you know, I don't want government, you know, telling me what to do in this regard. It should be the market that takes care of it. Okay, it sounds like you really care about personal autonomy. Is that a value that's important to you? You know, and so then we can go down how that value formed for them. And then what you're going to need to do is work your way back up to apply that to the issue at hand. You know, well, I think, you know, part of being autonomous is making sure that we actually have our voices effectively heard in government. Government is actually supposed to work for us. So, you know, and we can go down a path that way. There are multiple different paths we could go down from the autonomy value to sort of make a case from our perspective that has us on the same side on the value and perhaps helps bring them along with us. On that route, we want to be sure to ask a lot of questions so that we're not just telling at them, but we are asking them we're asking them to share with us so that they are talking out loud through their own cognitive dissonance. So that is a tricky one, certainly. But I think that's the kind of pathway of how we, when there are, you know, sort of objections down the path, we want to keep going back, and how can a shared value put us on the same side of this conversation as opposed to as adversaries. Madeline?
It's interesting to me, the thing of climate and voting, like how we go about combining, and so I thought it's like I've been doing more thinking than doing, but I want to see what you think about how I've been thinking about that. And I noticed in your conversation opener, it was, how important it is that our elected officials be strong on climate. Um, it, what I was thinking is like in my situation, if I'm talking to somebody and I don't know them that well, or they don't know me that well. Like if they know me well, they know where I am on climate. There is just no missing it if they know anything about anything I've done in my life the last 10 years. So if they don't know me well and I'm having a conversation with someone like what John was talking about, where they're not very strong on climate, as far as I can tell, that's one kind of conversation that's not really about voting to me at that point. It's about can I find out why they are where they are on climate and move them?
Mhm.
And if I'm talking to somebody that is strong on climate or pretty strong, because they know me and they agree with me, I still want to find out, well, are you going to vote in the primary? Because not everybody does, and I can share, like, I've been asking people, are they going to vote in the primary and hearing different things. And so I'm curious, like, I know I am, but, I know not everybody does. So where are you at on that? And then I can have a conversation about voting.
Mhm.
And then if I get somebody who's like strong on climate and strong on they're sure they're going to vote, then it's going to be like, do you want to help me with this climate voter campaign? So I think of it as three different kinds of conversations depending upon where the people are coming from, and I just wondered how that sounded, because we get the two mixed up together as we're thinking about how to move people.
Yeah, I would think of these as modular responsive conversations, and that we have different approaches with different people, right? And with some people, the whole journey may not happen in one conversation, as I was sort of previewing in the section about, story of us and story of now. With some people, it might. I have been part of very transformative, I've observed others conduct very transformative conversations, where people do go through all of these steps in one conversation. And one of the powerful things, though, about these being relational conversations is that we probably know where to find these people, and this isn't going to be the last time we see them. So we might be opening up a conversation that has multiple installations. And we certainly want to customize our approach for whether somebody is starting in a different position on climate. We want that to be certainly a different approach than somebody who's already with us on climate. So yes, absolutely, there are those three different categories that you mentioned, Madeline. I think that's a great way to think about it and kind of organize it in our heads. And we can think about them as like almost little modules, or as modular, right? Responsive conversations, where if the person's already with us on climate, we don't need module 1. We can skip that. We can just acknowledge that and move right to module 2, about connecting that to voting. And if they're already with us on both of those things, we can move to module 3, that is about getting them involved as a volunteer. So yeah, great breakdown. Stefano. Oh, Stefano, you're muted. Oh, we still have you muted. Here, I'm pressing ask to unmute, so hopefully that'll put up a little button for you to press to unmute.
Sorry, that's because I logged in with my phone as well, and I was hoping to speak. That's okay.
No worries.
I want to go back to John's comment about what happens if you get someone who has values that seem out of sync with your own. And I think the example you gave, John, was, well, I don't want government involved in this, right? Is that about right? And I just think people are always revealing their values, whether they realize it or not. So I wonder about saying, so what is it about that that disturbs you, or what's important to you? He says, well, I think we ought to make our own choice. Yeah. So you really value autonomy, and actually that each person gets to make their choice and express themselves for themselves. No one's telling them what to do, right? He goes, yeah. You say, well, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm so involved in the voting campaign now. I'm really hoping that each person will express their own opinion through a vote, our constitutional way of doing that. But I've heard all kinds of people say things about it. What do you think about that? I mean, is that something that resonates with you, or how do you think you express your vote, your voice, like that?
Brilliant. Yeah, brilliant application of those principles. Love that example. Yes, spot on. Lisa.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about a situation where two groups of people may be on the same side, and but one might be even more to the left than another, for example. And what's really different is the theory of change, i.e., somebody may feel that incremental change is okay, and another, if have people around them that are suffering, might say, no, that's not enough. And so when you're thinking about story of now versus story of us and transitioning to story of now, it would seem like if you fundamentally have a different theory of change that's so basic like that, it may be really hard to make that bridge. And have you used that in that situation at all?
Yeah, I think what's important there, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think what's important there is that we are having a conversation about sort of what's on the table before us, like a very specific thing that's on the table before us in the coming months, right? And so we're not having a conversation about what is the ultimate perfect way to resolve climate change, right? Like that's a bigger and different conversation. And it doesn't mean that that's not a valuable conversation and that we can't have productive conversations about that. It just means that the scope of this conversation is a little bit narrower when we're talking about the story of now. We're talking about, like, at that moment, that's where we've got that person who we've gone through sort of module 1 and module 2 with them, to use the framing that we've been using based on Madeline's framework. And now that person is like ready for the ask, right? And so we are in a position where it's going to land well for us to convey the urgency of either coming out to vote as a climate voter, or depending on where the conversation went, maybe even volunteering. And that's where we're going to make a very narrow and specific ask that is about right now. It's about, will you make a plan with me to vote, and we can drive together at 11 a.m. or 3 p.m. on election day, or we can fill out our ballots, mail-in ballots together, or whatever the case may be. Or it's a very specific ask, like one of the things that we're doing in CCL is X, Y, and Z, and the next event is on Thursday at 4, and the next one after that is at Saturday at 2. Which one would you like to come? So it's like, it's not like we are going to solve the whole climate crisis by doing this on Thursday. It's like, this is an urgent need right now, and will you come with me to do this next thing about this urgent need? Does that make sense? Does that help clarify?
It does. I was just curious whether we could utilize these discussions in different situations that have very big rifts among groups. And I was just curious if there's a way to use this to kind of broach some of those issues. But it sounds like it's probably better used in a more specific and narrow area.
Well, narrative is always helpful in basically any setting where we're trying to create change. My brain was very much focused on what we were doing right here, right now, when we answered the question. However, like in that kind of group setting where there are rifts, having a group conversation about the shared values and doing some strategic planning based on a set of criteria that everybody buys into can help create a cohesive story of us and now for the group itself, which can help heal those rifts and define a path forward. So it's definitely a tool that you can use in those settings. It would just be a slightly different application. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, acknowledge, or I mean, it's true that there are some people they're not going to change their mind. And so we just, like at what point, I guess, do you just kind of, are there clear signals? Are there, I don't know. Just wondering if, what you have to say about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm gonna, and we burned through our time very quickly today. So I'm gonna answer this question and then let Madeline tell us what next steps are. But so when we're doing election work, right, and really any work that's about recruiting people to do a thing, whether it's write a letter to their member of Congress or their state legislator, or go to the Capitol, or it's recruiting volunteers, right? We're always sifting. So I use this sort of framework or visual that's golden nugget theory, right? It's like we're sifting through sand for the golden nuggets. And we're talking with people that are already out there who are either with us on climate and they're not climate voters yet. So we need to engage them to be climate voters. They're with us on both climate and voting, and now they need to be asked to be volunteers. Or there are those people that you're talking about, Elizabeth, who are way at the other end of the spectrum. And some of those people are ready to be persuaded. They are ready to have that cognitive dissonance resolved. They are ready to align their actions with their values. And our conversation is going to take that from possibility to reality. And that's true. It's not going to be for every single person, and that's okay, right? But we're sifting for those people who are definitely out there, and the conversation is going to be effective. And I would say the place to say like, probably I'm not going to squeeze blood from this stone. It's time to move on, is if you are continually trying to bring the person back into real lived experience and they will only stick with TV talking points, right? Like if you have said for the fourth time, how does that affect you and your family? And you've shared little nuggets of your story and you've tried to ask into values. And every time you get like a TV talking point, it's time to go, okay, maybe another day, or maybe next year, or it's time to move that time and spend it on somebody who's already ready and you just haven't talked to them yet. So those are some signals that it can not be going anywhere. But again, I do want to give the caveat that all of the effect of the conversation doesn't happen necessarily in the conversation. So if their position is still stridently the same, but they have had a little bit of a journey with you on talking through some of the cognitive dissonance, there is generally an impact of that. And it doesn't always happen during the conversation. Sometimes it happens days, weeks, or months later. And we know this because when we have measured the effect of these conversations, we often have people do that rating scale, like self-share the rating scale at the beginning and end of the conversation, and then take an anonymous survey later where they don't know the survey is related to the conversation because it's buried with things that are about all different other topics. And sometimes they move after the conversation. Their self-report at the end changes later on. So it's not necessarily if they're not moving position that it's time to close off the conversation. It's if you really can't get them past that adversarial frame or that TV talking point frame into real lived experience with emotional weight. Okay, Madeline, we burned through the time pretty quickly with these questions. I hope it was useful.
No. We have another half an hour, Brandon.
we
I
do?
stuck that in the
Oh, okay.
chat. You're doing great. But yeah,
Yay.
yeah.
I mean,
so-
we're perfectly on time. That was my master plan. Thank you for reminding me how time works. I appreciate it. Okay, great. So now we can get into the third part of the conversation, right on time. The conversations that you have had, or the imaginations that you have had about what conversations might be like. So I'd love to hear from anybody that's had a conversation and anybody that's imagined a conversation. If you've had a conversation, I would love to hear just how that played out, whether or not you have questions about it. And if you haven't had a conversation, but you've had an imagining that sparked a question, I would love to hear about that as well. So, yes, Tom.
Well, I started with an easy person. One of my brothers, he's on board with climate and everything. We talk about it every now and then, but I had to ask for him because he just flew back from to and from Boston. He lives outside of Milwaukee, and his one of his daughters ran in the Boston Marathon, and so he went to watch her do that. But and so I asked him about carbon offsets, and did you ever think about doing that? And I explained that there's a lot of controversy about that, and you pay money to certain groups, and they don't really offset the carbon, or they offset it with something that's already offsetted, or there's no guarantees, there's no standards. But I told them that my last flight, which was a year ago in February, I had that same dilemma, and I just decided to throw some money to Nature Conservancy because they buy up land and preserve it and all that stuff. And it might not be totally perfect, but I know that's what they do. And he said that he already sends money to a group called Rails to Trails, which is turning old railroad beds to trails, bike paths and whatnot. And he thought, well, maybe I can throw them some more money because I took the flight, and that was perfectly what I would wanted him to do. Is he took a flight, take some responsibility for that, and do something about it. So it worked very well. But like I said, it was an easy in, but
I love that. And so in the conversation, did you get into the values underlying at all? Did you get into any of that kind of conversation?
I think they were, well, because he knows I do all the CCL stuff and all that. So they're kind of shared. We've talked about this over the years,
Mm-hmm.
off and on, not constantly or anything, but so they were there in the background. It's like,
Awesome.
well, you burned extra carbon, so you got to do something about it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, one thing that I'll invite everybody to think about, inspired, not necessarily in direct response, but inspired by your share, Tom, is, and I have not always done this myself, by the way. Sometimes when we have the easy conversations, we don't go through all the steps, right? And I remember back when I was working in presidential politics, I was doing a one-to-one with a woman who started volunteering for us, and ultimately she became my field director, like reporting to me. And in our first one-to-one, she was so easy. I skipped some of the steps, and she haunted me for the rest of the time that I knew her about it. She was like, "You didn't go through that step when you did the one-to-one meeting with me." And it was actually a really good lesson for me because we can leave change on the table if we skip over some of the steps, right? So going through that connection on shared values is super helpful. It's a gift that will keep on giving. It's a gift that can help you attach to an action that might be a little more difficult or a little more high bar, and can help you really move a person up a leadership ladder or to a different spot on the matrix of engagement. And in this case, you know, taking that climate commitment and the values that underlie it and applying them, for example, to voting. So just want to encourage somebody, or not somebody, everybody, to learn the same lesson that I learned in that haunting way, which is to try to always, you know, sort of go through that step of connecting on values and stories explicitly in each conversation. And, you know, and giving people, you know, like we have so many not constructive ways for dopamine hits to happen in our lives with our little special machines and so forth that are set up to do that. A really great way for people to get a dopamine hit is just to have that conversation about like, oh yeah, you know, I am taking responsibility, and that's like a value that we share. Oh, and here's another way I can do that in my life, and have some of these pro-climate activities actually be, you know, pro dopamine activities as well, especially where we get so much messaging that makes it feel overwhelming, and from a behavioral science standpoint, paralyzing. It's really important that we grab those and cultivate those positive pro-climate dopamine hits when we can. Okay, I think we had Elizabeth next and then Holly. Elizabeth? Which way am I pointing?
Well, Holly had her hand up first.
Oh, she's on the other side in my screen, so I was like, what's happening over there?
Okay.
Holly, go ahead. Thanks for
Um,
doing that,
Either
Elizabeth.
way is fine. I'll be brief, Elizabeth. I just wanted to say I had a very humbling conversation, and I really wanted to be here tonight to reinforce the values piece, because I asked someone who is in the library with me while I was Zooming in Florida, on the panhandle of Florida. I asked, it so happened that he was listening to some things, and so we talked afterward, and I assumed there's a couple things. I assumed, because he was a landscaper, I assumed that he would have some angle on anything's changing, and oh, was he did he not? So I got the government end of things and the all kinds of things, and I could have used, I was I would have liked to be the control group, and you come and do this conversation with, and I see how it could be done. But anyway, I learned values, got to go to values, and so I want to keep practicing with that. But I just want to say that another thing I learned was that I ask questions, but when someone disagrees with me, I'm really puzzled. You know, I'm puzzled. There isn't climate change. Okay. Oh, really? And I can ask more questions about that. I kind of get sucked into, kind of the follow rather than, okay, how did you get there? I mean, I got some of how did you get there, but it's still like, really? So, so, so I gotta work on that values thing and verbalize it. Because I knew, I mean, I zeroed in on how does this affect him and whatever, and it's like, no, the government just makes everything worse. But I will say this is not sorry, this is not brief, but I will say this final statement. He reached out and shook my hand, and he said, I'll look into it. And I honestly think I changed something in there. Even though he was vehement. Poor guy. I didn't know what I was getting into, and he sure didn't know what he was getting into.
That's brilliant. I mean, these interactions, like, right, humans are messy, right? We've been saying that from the first session, and it turns out, yeah, humans are messy, and they don't have to be like, you know, textbook conversations out of a training module to be effective. In our divisive world, the fact that you walked away with a handshake and he's probably got some wheels turning in his head, that's a successful conversation, right? Every conversation I have ever walked away from, I've thought of X, Y, and Z things I could have done differently. That's never going to stop. And conversations have made a concrete difference in the lives of people and in their behavior and changed their behavior. So both things can be true and usually are true at once. I haven't walked away from one yet where I was like, perfect, nothing to change there. That I've held. So we can sort of release ourselves from that expectation. I do want to say that we have been trained culturally, most of us. I haven't met anybody that, sort of grew up in the US or really in Western society generally that has escaped this. We've been trained in a debate model of how to address issues, right? This is how our political system works. This is how our legal system works. It's an adversarial system, right? That's what we call our legal system. And so that training is very deep of we want to dissect the argument. We want to dissect the argument. We want to figure out what is the logic and how can we intervene in the logic of it. These conversations are very different from that, and it takes some practice to get there. And I say this as somebody who went through law school, right? I have had all of that training and untrained for these conversations. And so when somebody, and we're gonna look, people are not feeling great about institutions right now, and they're not wrong, right? Necessarily, in their frustration. And so really remembering that we can agree, we can acknowledge the frustration, right? That's like sort of around step 2. We can acknowledge the frustration without agreeing with their stance on the issue. And in acknowledging that frustration, that can kind of open them up to go deeper about how does this affect you and your family. If we're still in the back and forth of like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. How did you get there? Give me the logic. Like that can actually be a little bit of a road to nowhere because they're still defending their point. And we want to get the shoulders down on that, acknowledge, yeah, you must be very frustrated about that. I can understand that. I can see where that would be very frustrating for you, right? If somebody's expressing, government is doing X, Y, and Z wrong, and these clowns, and this, that, and the other. Yeah, that can be very frustrating. I understand how that could be frustrating to you. Full stop. Let that sink in for a minute. And then can you tell me how that affects you and your family? This way they can be more open to answering the question at that level. And it might take them a few spins, right? People have pent up anger and a sense of powerlessness. And that just is the world that we're living in right now. And so it might take them a few spins of, well, this, and this. Okay, yes, I understand your frustration. Can you tell me more about how that affects you and your family? And then that's where we can get into, is that frustration coming from a value around honesty and truth? Is it coming from a value around responsibility? Is it coming from a feeling of powerlessness, or a sense that they want more autonomy or safety and security? So that can be helpful. And sometimes it does take a couple spins to get there, and then that's okay. Okay, Elizabeth.
Well, my story ended with a handshake too, Holly. So, and it was also, there were a lot of things that were missed along the way, but it was the most productive conversation I've had with somebody who was clearly very skeptical about our position. And it happened at a tabling event. So we had our display, and the guy walked by 3 different times, kind of eyeing the display, and ignored our first, like welcome over. It was like, no. Then he came over and he pointed at the sign that says 2023 was the hottest year on record. He pointed to that and he said, more people die from the cold than from heat. So I'm like, okay, here we go. And there was somebody with me, and so she actually kind of started first, and I can't remember. It ended up talking to him for like 15 minutes though. And the tell me more, that was so great. That was really helpful. And just trying to, did find some values, but I can't remember very clearly now whether I like express. So it sounds like, you are worried about this, or you value fairness, or this is important to you. I mean, there were some things like he mentioned, well, I care about, I care about, I'm trying to think of how he put it exactly, trees and things like that. I like the outdoors. My kids, I want them to have clean air and clean water. So, he did say some of those things, but I feel like what felt kind of successful is that I think he clearly, it seemed to me anyway, was looking for a bit of a fight, like he kind of wanted to get into it. Instead, I mean, we had a really good conversation and we did find some common ground. Like, well, how do you feel about nuclear? He said. And I said, well, I'm open to that. I think we probably are going to need to use nuclear. And so I think, his perception changed of what somebody like me is
Yeah.
like. Now, unfortunately, I sure wish I could go back and like, there are a whole bunch of things now that I wish I would have asked him about. And I wish I knew who this person was and I could go back and continue the conversation. But it was, there was a lot of dopamine hits during that conversation. That's why, so I don't feel like I can remember it as clearly as I'd like, but it was a good experience.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. That's phenomenal. A handshake is an enormous metric of success, by the way. And um, clearly you were helping him talk out loud through his own cognitive dissonance, right? He was saying things on both sides. And, just to back up and think about the broader context of the world in which we're living, right? People are listening to and watching media that is demonizing people with different issue stances as though they are, monsters with horns coming out of their heads. Um, and I feel like, you maybe pierced a bubble of that for him. And that's part of what the acknowledging frustrations and the non-judgment does, right? It's the rehumanization that needs to happen in our current political context in order for there to be a pathway open to persuasion. And so it sounds to me like you opened that pathway, and maybe there'll be some other person who has a conversation with him and it's starting at a different point now, or maybe he continues thinking and looking at different things online or wherever, right? Again, you don't know the full effect of the conversation when the person walks away. I will say,
Imagine that. I'm going to
yeah,
imagine a full revolution in his brain.
excellent. And also, this brings me to the fifth step, right? The extending the ask for engagement. Even if a person is not with us, we can ask them to stay engaged with us. And I've had some very interesting conversations where the ask at the end was just for a follow-up conversation and the person shared their contact info, right? So we always should have in mind that even if it's not a person that's going to sign up as a volunteer with CCL next week, that on this conversational pathway, we can ask a stranger if they would like to continue the conversation. And many times they will say yes. And you will be actually shocked at how many times they will say yes, even when they're not in agreement. But it's been one of these conversations where you can see there's like a little bit of something happening. So I would say err on the side, even if you feel like, oh my goodness, this is bananas. I can't believe I'm asking this person. I would say err on the side of asking if they would like to stay in the conversation and getting the contact info. And again, this is all up to your style and how you work, but I often will just make a little bit of, again, like a self-deprecating, not fully a joke, but like a little light comment like, all right, this is going to sound a little crazy, but I would really love to continue this conversation with you. What do you think? Could we exchange contact info, or could I grab your info and, maybe we'll have a follow-up at some stage type of a thing. And that can be very effective to put a person on an engagement pathway. Jean.
Okay, so I had my first real, brave conversation today. In fact, I live in a retirement community and I'm going to be here the rest of my life. So I have to keep that in mind. These are going to be my neighbors forever. So that's in the back of my mind. And usually we talk a lot over meals. But that doesn't work. You have to do it one-on-one. So I don't know, I asked one of the gentlemen who's, had a lot of breakfasts and dinners and stuff. I said, I like to, what do you think? I mean, talking to people one-on-one is a lot different than talking to them in a group. What do you say we just go up, some afternoon and to the place called Lola's, which is more than a bar, but it's a place where you can get a drink. And let's just tell me your whole story and I don't get snippets. So we did that today. We had an hour set aside. So, I mean, I heard his life story and I shared a little bit of mine and stuff like that. And it was good. And then I was it didn't really work because two things happened. One is I couldn't really, I sort of was nebulous about what his values were. I was grasping at the words for him. And I got, between listening and grasping for the words, I didn't really do that very well. And then he has and I'm mostly focused because of here. I'm focused on the election and not so much on climate change, just because of the people here. And so basically, he was really expressing his strong hate of government. I mean, it's a mess for him. He doesn't respect any politician. Thinks they're all just in it for the money, and the two people at the top of the ballot aren't all that different to him. And I was like talking to myself, like, what should I be saying to move this along? I just got lost right there, And then we ran out of time. I was, going to say, tell me more. I did say, when did you first start thinking this way? And he said, every time this current politician speaks, I get this. So anyway, it just didn't really go anywhere. But he lives here, I live here. We can have another conversation. And I could, next time I see him, say, have you always felt this way about government? And well, when did has it always been there? And how does it affect you and your family? And then yeah, so I kind of got a little bit going, but I'm not at my notes here. But I thought I would do a better job since I've been teaching this to other people around here that have brave conversations. So anyway, that's what's been going on with me. I still counted it as a CCL conversation because we did talk about climate change. So yeah, he's all for climate change and he very much respects me, but he's nowhere on the issue of the election. No pathway forward did I see in this conversation of an hour. So
yeah. Well, I think that is excellent. 3 cheers for you. First of all, I think it was very brave to ask for the one-to-one conversation. I think that's fantastic. And one of the things that is true, to your point about kind of got lost of where to go, is that it can be hard to put all the pieces together at once at first. So one thing that can be helpful is to pick one thing. Not that you're going to leave all the rest of the steps out, but to pick one thing that's within the steps going to be your primary focus for a certain day or a certain week. So primary focus might be, my conversation today, I'm going to focus primarily on listening for shared values. Or on my conversation today, I'm going to focus on being vulnerable in my story. Or my conversation today, I'm going to make sure and focus on really extending that ask at the end of the conversation. Or maybe it's non-judgment and curiosity at the beginning of the conversation, right? So we can pick one thing to kind of be our primary focus to sort of organize our minds. And that can be a helpful way to practice on humans, with humans. The other great thing about relational conversations is that, as you said, Jean, you know where to find them and you have a great place to pick up the conversation, right? Part of what I hear there is that he cares a lot about integrity And that's like a thread that you could pull on. And, sort of where I go when people are frustrated with government is that like acknowledging the frustration and that the pathway, and this is like after the listening to values, this is after we found the shared value, and it's more of the appropriate time to share how we feel. And what's authentic and honest for me is that it only goes more in that direction that's unpleasant if we don't participate, and that in order to switch the direction, we need to actually participate, which creates then that accountability. So that may or may not be something that's authentic and resonant for you, but I think this will come up a lot. So I'm just putting that out there as a nugget for inspiration.
Wait. We need to participate in government? Is that what you're saying?
In voting, in order
In voting?
to
Oh, okay,
improve
got it. Okay.
government. In other
Okay,
words,
I
it
thought you
only-
meant participate something in the conversation. No, you're talking about the government. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I see now that we are actually now 3 minutes to the end of time. So I want to really just, I'm so like over the moon at these conversations that y'all have had. And for those of you who haven't had conversations yet, the brilliant questions that you're asking, I'm super excited to hear how the conversations continue to grow, and just want to really congratulate each of you for being on this journey. And for those of you that had conversations, for the great success that you had in them, really brilliant. And Madeline, I would love to turn it back to you in order to share any next steps that you might like to with the crew.
That sounds good. And I completely endorse everything Brandon just said about y'all. And it's been really good having these workshops. So hopefully you've all noticed that we have a Google group now called voter-conversations at googlegroups.com. And that is where I will post the recording from this workshop. That is where I will post the training video that Brandon mentioned and the story template. That will all go onto the Google group. Now you can also post things on the Google group. And if you hate the thought of getting all those emails, then go in your settings and select Daily Digest, and we'll help you if you need that. But this kind of conversation we've started to open up here tonight is something that we can do with each other through the emails, where when you've just had, you're coming off a conversation, you can tell us about it in the Google group, and you can bet that some of us are going to go, hey, wow, add a girl, do it again, or answer a question, or sympathize, or whatever. That's part of its purpose. So try it out and we'll see how well that works. And again, if you start to feel like that's too many emails, then turn it into a daily digest, or you can unsubscribe. There are 102 people who have expressed some amount of interest in this work, and they're all on that group. And we do want to keep it focused just to that, to our conversations. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will start doing live on Zoom 45-minute check-ins. So if you don't like communicating by email, you can get on Zoom approximately every other Thursday night. And again, share, ask questions, and continue to deepen our practice, because I think we all are finding we're learning. I'm not going to record those. I might stick some notes in from them afterwards, but those are going to be just us. So if you want that experience, you got to come. It will be, there's two things you need to put in your mind about this, and we will put reminders about that in the Google group. It is an hour earlier, because that made my life happier, and I will hope it doesn't hurt turnout. So it's 6 Central, and it's only 45 minutes. It's not an hour and a half. So you could still do something with the rest of your evening. And that's 7 Eastern, and it's not limited to Wisconsin, all you wonderful people from outside the state. And the other thing is that we don't have a registration process for it. So you don't have to register ahead of time. So then you go, okay, how do I get the link? So how you get the link is that we have a CCL Wisconsin calendar that is on the cclwi.org website. And if you go click on May 9th, if you go find your way to that calendar, I'm sure you can do it, and go to May 9th, you will see Courageous Conversations, and you click on that and the link is in there. I will probably also stick it in the Google group until such time as we get a Zoom bomber. So don't share it. All right, if you've got questions, you know where to find me. I look forward to this continuing. I treasure every story I've heard, both the ones where you lead in, and I made this mistake, and then I made that mistake, and then I made the other mistake, and the ones where you go, wow, that was better than I thought, or that was really cool. I treasure every single one of them. I think that's it. Jill, anything to add? Jill's an invaluable partner in all this stuff happening.
No, this has been so wonderful though. I really enjoyed it and I appreciate everybody being here and Brandon, especially you for sharing all this great information. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Madeline too for leading this and continuing to lead the Courageous Conversations.
Well, thanks for letting me build this plane with you while we fly it. Okay, off you go. It's 8:32 in my time, and have a good night, and keep trying stuff.
Good night.